I want to introduce today's speaker. Her name is Shantini Ramakrishnan, and she is, I wrote it down, she has a very long title. She's the Conservation and Restoration Education Program Manager at Rio Mora Wildlife Refuge Center. So thank you very much, Shantini. Take it away.
Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me today in what is, I think, a pretty full-on week for everyone. So I appreciate your time. As Julie mentioned, my name is Shantini, and I'm in a fairly new position with Highlands. So the programs that I will talk about today has actually been in place for over 10 years. And I've been involved in those programs since 2012, working with Highlands, but I only joined the Highlands team in August of this year. So I'm fairly new to the university itself. And so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and hopefully there'll be no issues. Did that work?
Yay, yes.
Yay, Lordy, awesome, okay. Great. Did it go into presenter mode though? There we go, awesome. Okay, and so a lot of what I do is kind of falls under the umbrella of place-based education. And what we mean by place-based is really about the landscape. And for those of us based in Northern New Mexico, we are so fortunate to have places where we can easily access, places that are beautiful, inspiring, and also places that are rich in cultural and historic narratives that are embedded in these spaces and these landscapes. And so when we work with a lot of local students, usually they too are connected to these landscapes and they have their own personal connections, be it to their own family ranches or where they go hunt, fish, camp, or where they spend their summers. Now, of course, sometimes we also work with urban students. It doesn't necessarily mean Los Angeles or Dallas. Sometimes I'm talking about Albuquerque, even in students who have not ventured too far past pavement. Places like this can be both awe-inspiring as well as a little bit scary. And so to make places like this more accessible, what we like to do is to provide immersive experiences to students. And I mean immersive in the most literal sense. So this is what I mean when I say I want to get dirt under students' fingernails. I mean, we hand dig a soil pit and we get them in the pit, right? And so instead of just looking at a picture of what a soil strata means, they get into a pit, they get to hand texture soils, they get to see the organic matter that's in the soil profile, they get to look at the minerals in there, and they really get, immersed into that experience essentially. And really start to think about how soils, which is something we don't often think about, in fact, we often just call it dirt, right? But how soils really influence the kind of crops we can grow, the type of forage and the amount of forage we have for livestock, for our wildlife, what is the capacity for soil to hold water? These are all things that are pertinent to our students. And of course, we can't really work in natural systems without talking about water, because there's so little of it, essentially. It is a resource we value. And while most students recognize that water is important, we try and showcase in some of these immersive experiences aspects of water that they may not be familiar with. So in the top left photo, we have students seining the river. So this is the Mora. They're literally scooping up macroinvertebrates from the sediment at the bottom of the river, as well as in vegetation, and then looking at those macroinvertebrates, categorizing them, and seeing how they relate to water quality. So for example, if you have certain macroinvertebrates that are very sensitive to pollutants and you find them, that is usually an indicator that your river system is in relatively good shape. If all you're finding is leeches, that's probably a system that could use a little bit of work. In the bottom left picture, we're electrofishing, we're electroshocking fish. So this is obviously not a cold trout-filled river. It's a little bit warmer than that. And so we're finding creek chubs and stone rollers and fish that generally most students are not too familiar with. And it's also an opportunity for us to look at some introduced species. So something like the northern crayfish, which is an invasive that is very common in the Mora and the Gainas and in a lot of the tributaries here. And they're voracious predators that can really change our river systems. And sometimes we literally get our students elbow deep in dung as well. We really get them right into everything. This dung beetle lesson is a really good lesson on teaching students how to conduct their own little mini study. So instead of learning about nutrient cycling and decomposers from simply a classroom lecture, we get them to develop a hypothesis on what would influence the number or abundance of dung beetles in a paddy. And then they get to break up a paddy, count the dung beetles, and then test their hypothesis and their predictions to see if it was accurate. This is also a classic immersive experience that students may not identify as their most favorite moment of the day, but it is often their most memorable. It's what they go home and tell their parents about. It's what they brag to their peers who didn't go on this field trip. And it's what they come back and remember when they come back to you. Even a year later, I've had students come back to me and say, lady, I'm not digging through poop this year for you. It's something that they remember and appreciate, I guess. And these sorts of experiences are couched under, I guess, what we call high impact practices. And these are best practices for encouraging student enthusiasm for the sciences, for encouraging student retention, and also student success. And these particular practices are shown to be integral to student successes, particularly in amongst student populations of color, because they're non-traditional and they're more hands-on and they're more integrative to our lives. They're a little bit more relevant to our lives. And so I'm going to go through a little bit on how we do all of these things here at the Conservation Science Center at Highlands. And so field skills is simply that. You go out, you collect data, you learn how to do it again and again at different sites. You learn how to do it accurately. You learn how to clean up your data after you've made mistakes in it, because human error is inevitable. And you also learn that these are skills that you can learn with practice. And so these sorts of field skills are developed initially with a fair amount of guidance, and then it leads towards more independence. It encourages confidence in students, teamwork, as well as problem-solving skills when they're at different sites and encounter different circumstances. This can be a really good confidence booster for students as they get more and more proficient in these skills. Service projects is another type of experience that we and practice that we offer and promote. These tend to be habitat restoration projects. So we have in the photo on the left is an arroyo restoration project where we rocked a head cut to prevent further erosion. In the project on the right, which was just a month ago, we worked within a wetland system to extend the availability of water over space and time. And in all of these cases, the students are taking things that they might have learned in a classroom and applying it on the landscape. And these projects promote community engagement. So they're either participating in a community project, or they might have a specific project that's particular for that particular class. And the goal, or the one thing we do stress with these projects, is that students think beyond their own academic careers. And sometimes we're asking them to think beyond their lifetimes, because we're talking about ecological projects. So these are things beyond any individual. From there, students often will move to a citizen science project. And citizen science is the type of research where you have a lot of individuals contributing towards a larger data set. Now, citizen science are also often called CitSci projects. It can be projects that multiple cohorts of the same class will conduct and collect the same data over the years, or it can be a once a year sort of thing. It just depends on the way the project is designed. It is important in CitSci projects to design research that involves data collection that is on a scale that is appropriate for multiple data collectors over multiple times of year over multiple years. So for example, you probably wouldn't design a project that would involve students identifying grasses, because they're kind of difficult to do, but using a handheld sonde to take water quality measurements like temperature or turbidity or pH would be appropriate. And that would be useful as a data set to have over a longer term. And now that you've trained your students to be highly proficient in collecting data, you've trained your students to practice being researchers by participating in CITSI projects, you now have the opportunity to really have your students conduct their own research. So this could be a capstone undergraduate project, or it could be a graduate project. And these sorts of research is far more independent. It's far more intensive. So students are developing research questions. They're coming up with a study design. They are implementing the research. They're analyzing their data, interpreting it, and then reporting or communicating that out. Sometimes they're even asked to provide recommendations or guidelines to move forward. And this is particularly important here at Highlands because we work with so many students who come from underrepresented audiences. And so most of our students don't see themselves in a lot of researchers and a lot of STEM professionals out there. And so by steadily progressing their careers, their academic careers as a student, to become more and more proficient in the sciences, they're finally able to then not just conduct themselves as a researcher, but actually believe that they can do this research. And that's also part of the student development process. And as usually, you do get some students who kind of gravitate towards leadership positions, but I found that a lot of students I've worked with don't often have the opportunity to showcase that aspect of themselves and their skills. And so sometimes it's namely about providing opportunities for that to happen. So if we have a student or an intern who goes out and does a training, one great way to develop their leadership skills is to have them come back and train you and your team. That way they get to practice what they've learned. Or in the case of the photo on the right, we had a biology sophomore and a chemistry sophomore student from Highlands. They're in the white lab coats. And they were asked to give a workshop to some high school students from West. So these are two Las Vegas residents giving a workshop to seniors from West. They're like 1 or 2 years older at most. And they're totally geeking out. They're blowing up gummy bears. They're making ice cream from liquid nitrogen. And it's such an empowering moment to see those leaders and those student mentors within your own community. And so, because we don't see a lot of that out there in the world right now, sometimes we're finding those faces that look like us and giving them a platform to showcase their expertise and to take on those leadership experiences. And I mentioned earlier the cultural and historic perspective that is embedded within our natural landscapes. Those perspectives are important, but they're often not heard. And so part of what we can do when practicing or when teaching and when putting together programs that involve high impact practices is to provide a platform, time, and those perspectives. So providing places and spaces where we get federal and state agency personnel, we get private landowners, we get wildlife managers and livestock managers all in the same room together. And also bringing these STEM professionals who've probably got their degrees 20 years ago, interacting with our current aspiring STEM professionals who are in their classrooms now or who are in grad school now, interacting together because these are our future next generation land managers, and giving them a place and a space to have that interaction and networking as well. These are just some perspectives from past students who have gone through these practices. And I wanted to just pause a little bit, let you read that on your own. Carmen was a forestry major as well as She now works for the Forest and Watershed Restoration Institute. She's a former colleague of mine as well. And she's now doing really great at the Institute. And one more student perspective is a current undergraduate student, Annie Topal. She's from Papua New Guinea. So you can imagine what her experience is like in the semi-arid environment that we have. But she's also come out, done internships and classes with us where we've given her these sorts of immersive experiences. And with that, I stuck to my 15 minutes. And if there's any questions, I'm happy to take them.
Shantini?
I'm gonna end sharing.
Okay, Shantini?
Yes.
It's Dr. Romine. No, I just had a question about your program. What kind of evaluations do you do for your program to know that you're meeting your goals and you know, trying to do what you want to do with it?
So it depends on the program itself. So for example, if it's a service project, I probably don't have an inbuilt evaluation. But if it's a lesson or a day where we're bringing in a bunch of students and running a bunch of workshops, then we embed the evaluation as part of an activity that students have to do. That way we are, because nobody ever sends you back anything after they leave. And so if it's not embedded, we'll never capture that information ever. And so we try and get that incorporated into the program and carve out time for that as well.
Okay, all right, thanks.
If you'd like to ask a question, go ahead and unmute yourself or type it in the chat, and I'll keep an eye on that.
Shantini, you indicated you've been out there for a while in various capacities. Can you share with the group probably some of the more memorable experiences that you have, or you know, what are those experiences that you think are most important that you believe you've been involved in?
So one high impact practice that I didn't cover was seasonal internships. And that involves a smaller subset of students. So I kept it to kind of the larger student group. But we have been fortunate since 2012 to host anywhere from 2 to 4 seasonal interns from Highlands on an annual basis. And it's interesting because, you know, we had a very small team. At that time, I was based on the refuge, and we had a very small team. So when we have students come in, it's suddenly our team has expanded by 50%. You know, even 2 students meant a 50% increase in capacity, and that meant we could do more of what we did quicker, and we could cover more area. We could do all that, and so I was very motivated to train everyone very quickly, so that they could go out independently. And one thing that worked that I don't know that on my end, I knew it was intentional at the time, but when you hand a student a $4,000 trimble and you tell them, go forth, I trust you with this amazing piece of equipment, and I trust that you know how to come back, and that you'll come back in one piece, and that you'll get the following things done. And they kind of look at you a little bit shell-shocked, because they're like, really? And it might take them twice as long the first time, but they do come back, and they come back with a little bit of a spring in their step and a little bit more, not just enthusiasm, but belief in themselves that they can not only take on stuff that you've trained them on, but have the capacity to learn new things. And be more ready for more uncertainty, for newer experiences, and for newer challenges coming their way. And that's a kind of a, you know, you positively reinforce it by giving them experiences where they can prove to themselves that they're capable and perfectly able to handle things that we do on a day-to-day basis.
You shared with us a little bit about the dung. Where did the dung come from? And tell us a little bit more about those animals.
So I have easy access to bison dung, so I tend to use bison dung, but I also have easy access to cattle dung, right? So, Eric Griffin, Professor Griffin, does a biology lab that he runs, and so we weren't able to do it this year, but last fall he gave me a list of types of research questions they had. So it was, whether dung beetle abundance would be affected by distance from the river, or age, or shape, because we have the flat patties and then we have what we call hoodoos, which are the taller ones. And so I would go out, I would keep track of the bison, I would record for for like 10 days or so that if he had an age question, I could go out and get different age dung or distance to river, and I would just label the bags and show up, and then they would be able to test it out. And then I can always call my neighbor and go get cattle dung. They never know why I'm calling to get cattle dung, but all our neighbors are pretty cooperative on that front.
Dr. Martinez stole my question. Do you still have the bison herd at Rio Mora?
We do. We do. It's run by the Pueblo Poake, so it's their animals. One day I'll be able to test out. I still am curious about calf dung versus adult dung, but that's really hard for me to figure out which is which, apart from size. But it's harder for me to answer that question.
So you said the students really remember that activity and they talk about it when they come back next year and may not want to do that again, but is there a favorite activity they tend to have, something that really draws them in?
If it's not too cold out, they love getting in the river. That's sense. Something that they, because we also put them in waders and, you just jump in. And it's just, I think the proper balance is to get them so engaged that they forget they're outside, they forget they're in school, they forget they're learning, they forget they're cool, they forget everything, and they're just there, right? And that's the experience that we're aiming for.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Shantini, what age groups, you mentioned high school, do you have any younger students that come out to do projects?
Middle school.
Middle school, okay.
Yeah. Very, very occasionally I go younger than that.
I was just wondering because it becomes more difficult when they're younger.
Yes, I might lose them down the river. But yes, we do have our local Girl Scout troop that comes out, and they're young, they're elementary school.
Okay.
Do you also take adult learners, ones who are well past the age of 30?
We are all lifelong learners, no matter where we are in our particular age group. Yes, so sometimes we actually have service projects where we bring in folks from across the state, really, back when it was safe to travel across the state and all of those things.
Shantini, are most of the immersive experiences you're talking about, are they just day trips out there? And do you have any plans to, kind of turn it into like more of a retreat center where people come and stay for several days?
So most of our overnight visits tends to be over the summer, right? Whether it's a camp or a field course. Sometimes we have a multi-day field course as well. So these are college level accredited stuff. We have actually talking about maybe doing like weekend retreats for the local community next year. If things open up, I think that would be to speak to Julie's question about encouraging all of us to learn and continue to learn no matter where we are in our lifetimes, to have a kind of a truncated 2-day experience out in northern New Mexico, staying somewhere else and just kind of getting totally immersed into that experience. They would be themed, probably. I don't think I can get them to dig through dung, so it'll be something else.
You'd be surprised.
Well, does anyone have any other questions for Shantini?
I just have one in terms of what are you doing now, since we can't do anything face to face? Are you doing projects out there, or just people coming out doing research on their own? What's going on right now?
So if you have your own research, yes, you can go out. We can do, up until a few days ago, we were doing class sizes of 10 and below. Now we're doing class sizes of 5 and below. And I am, in lieu of bringing high school and middle school students, sending out high school and middle school kits where they can, so they are multi-based, project-based programs that the teachers can run. They can, so the first ones we sent out was an engineering kit. So it's an engineering challenge, actually. So they get their supplies, they have to build it, and then they have to run an experiment. So the high schoolers are actually building a blowgun, and then testing for precision and accuracy, whether they have a laser pointer attached or not, and then running some experiments indoors and outdoors, and then, you know, reporting back on a spreadsheet and that sort of thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was going to ask real quickly, Shantini, if you could mention some of the tribal youth engagement that's gone on there. And maybe along with that, one thing that strikes me is when we've had these activities, we've brought in a lot of other folks from other organizations and agencies to help support, and kind of the role of a place for folks to interact in that way and the relationships that get built.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the value of these programmings, is that everyone understands they're important, right? It is important for us to bring tribal youth to the table. It's important to bring underrepresented student populations to experience these things. But it is a fair bit of work to put these sorts of projects and programs together. And so one of the ways I found success in doing that is to set up, so I work with MESA, I work with the Native American Fish and Wildlife Society, I worked with the 8 Northern Pueblos, and they have programs that they run that either I'm bringing together the workshop organizations or I'm providing added value to programs they've already run. So it kind of depends on who's leading it and how far along they've gone. And then you find your little niche and fill it in that way. So for the Tribal Youth Camp, it's really important in that case for them to bring in tribal scientists and researchers. And so there's a network that comes in to support that effort. And then there's the wider, I would say, the wider STEM community that is involved as well. And then there's people that we meet in our day-to-day lives that also have a perspective that might be worth adding. So, for example, the Native American Fish and Wildlife Society, they have their cohort of people who are involved, but they always have gaps in their programs. And so when I suggest a program, I try and make it culturally relevant. I try and bring in partners that we have. So for us, the most obvious partner would be the Pueblo Huaque, right? Because we have the bison there, and we have the herders, the bison manager available. And so we would bring them in to talk about not just their perspective on bison management, but also, I was shocked that many of the students actually hadn't seen a bison before, because it felt like, you know, why the heck have I seen a bison before and worked with bison for so many years? And why is that experience not more readily available? And so we bring them in to share the perspective. If we can find the herd, which sometimes they're cooperative and sometimes they're not, we go out and see them. We will not interact per se, but, you know, at least observe them from a distance. And then we also bring in a cooking with bison component to that as well, so that they get to see the animal and all the different cultural connections to that animal on the landscape, through food, through management, all those different perspectives.
Shantini, there is just a comment from Dr. Spence Harrison in the chat, and he is the Native American liaison. If there's anything I can do to assist Native communities, let me know.
Yes, and I've been meaning to reach out to you, Dr. Harrison, and I apologize, but that's a good reminder that I will do so.
Good. Well, I think if there are no more questions, then we should let Shantini get back to her searching through dung for things. Just kidding. Thank you so much. This was really interesting and such a great resource for Highlands, and we really appreciate your time with us and your expertise.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.